So thank you, John. And hi, everybody. So I'm actually going to do a riff on Sheila's chapter. And Sheila can then come in with the elaboration of the Philippines case. But basically, if we look at what Josh presented yesterday, he basically was calling attention to the resurgence of the military in several Southeast Asian countries as an indicator of democratic decline. So what I'd like to do is take Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Myanmar, and by tomorrow morning, and look at Sheila's thesis on counterinsurgency and democracy, because what she argues is that counterinsurgency, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is fundamentally antithetical to democracy, that it creates an atmosphere and the use of violence against rebels or opposition people defined as the enemy, and that the tactics used include surrounding oneself with a sea of propaganda that amounts to lies and disinformation, and that these factors are critical ways of undermining democracy. So my question here is, to what extent have counterinsurgency operations actually served to weaken democracies in these four countries, or in the case of Myanmar and to some extent Thailand, destroy the democracies in these areas? So to what extent is the military's role in fighting armed insurgencies in these countries been a critical factor? And I think you can argue in all four countries that counterinsurgency operations have helped the military define its own identity as savior of the nation. I think you can argue that they've contributed to the military's financial and business interests, because in many of the areas to which they go for insurgency operations are also resource rich. And I think you can argue that they've led to an excuse or a pretext for acquisition of the latest arms and technology, and also to at least three of the countries, I'm not sure about Indonesia, to the military's becoming a veto player in the political system. So just worthwhile to go over the insurgencies that we're looking at in Southeast Asia in these four countries, both past and present, because in some ways the past insurgencies have been as important in shaping the military identity as the current ones. So in Burma, we had constant civil war and external threats after independence in 1948. We had factions of the Communist Party that were instrumental in creating an atmosphere of civil war that the military felt it had to fight. We had the Kuomintang in Shan State, and the idea that you had an outsider coming into Myanmar that also threatened the territorial integrity. And then in the present, of course, we had the horrific ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, but also all of the ethnic armed groups that were still operating in Burma up till the time of the coup. And I think the way that the Tatmadaw, or the Burmese military, has faced all of these insurgencies has very much turned it into the hegemonic power that it became. And it fought these insurgencies with no idea of winning hearts and minds, but rather crushing whatever it could with brute force. If we look at Thailand, we had in the past the communist insurgency with the Communist Party of Thailand, and later students joining that after the crackdown in the 1970s. And we also had the role that Thailand played as an ally of the United States during the Vietnam War and so on. I think that probably shaped part of the Thai military's identity, but it didn't have the same impact that the insurgencies and the constant civil war and external threats in Myanmar had with respect to the Burmese military. And then, of course, we have the Muslim Malay insurgency in the Deep South. I would argue that that doesn't seem to have been as much of a factor in the Thai military's recent decisions to basically remove democracy and instigate new coups in Thailand as other factors, most notably Thaksin and the threat that Thaksin posed to military hegemony in Thailand. In the Philippines, we have a whole history of insurgencies that I'll let Sheila go into, but starting with the Philippine-American War and then going through the Huk Rebellion, the efforts against the Communist Party and New People's Army, and then all of the insurgencies in the Muslim South. And in Indonesia, we had the regional rebellions in the 1950s, which arguably served to shape the Indonesian military as it is today as a very unified instrument of nationalism in combating these efforts to break away, mostly because of grievances against the central government. We also had the insurgencies in Aceh, West Java, and South Sulawesi, all linked to these regional rebellions. And of course, we had the army's confrontation with the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. Interesting to note that the PKI was once the third largest communist party in the world after the Soviet Union and China. And it was in Thailand, the Communist Party of Thailand was the second largest in the mainland Southeast Asia after the Chinese Communist Party. So today, we're left with the Papua Rebellion and the Papua conflict in the easternmost provinces now, there are 5 of them now, of Indonesia. But I would be hard pressed to argue that fighting the Papuan insurgency per se was the factor that was most important in the resurgence of the military in Indonesia. There are lots of other factors. If we go back to Burma, and this is where I had a PowerPoint and I left it at home, so you can't see any of the glorious graphics that I had. One scholar has noted that Burma is not so much a failed state, but a failed nation. And I think if you look at maps of Burma from the British colonial period, where you had very different administrative measures in the Burmese heartland as opposed to the periphery, and you look then at the way the ethnic armed groups developed after independence and up through the beginnings of some of these ceasefire negotiations in the early 2000s, and then to the post-coup violence, you see, first of all, that there's a very good correlation between the colonial era administration and these peripheral areas that turned into ethnic rebellions. But also that post-coup, the map has changed, as David was saying before. So you have violence now across the Burmese heartland, as well as in these ethnic peripheries. As I say, there was the impact of these insurgencies in Myanmar was to shape the military as the sole major power and prevented, in many ways, any political institutions from developing. But the fact that the military had this power also resulted in its economic influence and its economic control over major resources throughout Burma. In the coup was basically a decade of democratic opening destroyed. And the trigger for this was not the insurgencies per se, it was clearly Aung San Suu Kyi's landslide victory in 2020. But it's interesting that her association with the military, for which she's been so deeply condemned by the West, was probably a factor in increasing her electoral victory in 2020 over what she got in 2015, which was already a landslide. But it was the first real challenge that the military has faced institutionally from the NLD and from its leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, in a way that no other political development or political institution had really threatened their strategy. So I think that if we look at all four countries, Myanmar is the only one where you can say that the military remains an unquestioned hegemonic power, although David this morning suggests that that kind of power is now on the wane and that there is some chance that in the aftermath of the coup and the widespread disaffection with the military that we could see possible cracks in that system. I should also say that when we talk about militaries in Southeast Asia, nowhere are we talking about a monolith. I think even in Myanmar, we've had factions in the past, and even though we can't see them now, there may be factions emerging, especially in reaction to the coup. Indonesia, we've had many different kinds of cleavages, regional and otherwise, and also there's been an ongoing cleavage between the military as an institution and the Ministry of Defense, even though it's composed of mostly military people, the institutional interests are quite different. In Thailand, we saw basically democracy end with the 2006 coup against Thaksin, and then later the 2014 coup against his sister. But we did have a history of 13 coups from 1932 onward in Thailand in a way that served to demonstrate the military's ongoing political role. But unlike Myanmar, it was never as consolidated and it was never as unilaterally in political control as it was in Myanmar. You had the military in Thailand making periodic accommodations with other political actors, some of them civilians, and you didn't really have the insurgencies giving an additional boost to power or an additional form of influence the way that you had in Myanmar. In Indonesia, the military is definitely increasingly involved in civilian affairs. I don't think this is a direct result of the earlier insurgencies, either in its counterinsurgency operations against the PKI. Actually, it's not really accurate to call it counterinsurgency, more annihilation, but nor in the way that it fought insurgencies in Aceh or East Timor or in Papua. I don't think they vastly contributed to military power within the political system. What they did, these, especially Aceh, East Timor, and Papua, was to basically serve as areas for either making money or getting promotions. So within the military, the active involvement in counterinsurgency operations served military interest, unquestionably, but it didn't necessarily lead to influence in the way that government was conducted, I think, in the same way that it did in the Philippines. It's interesting, though, if we look at how the military is getting back into power in civilian areas, it goes back to Nava's point about Jokowi basically opening the door to a number of new kinds of duties for the military, from being in charge of COVID operations, to serving as agricultural extension agents, to serving as head of state enterprises. There are increasingly an increasing number of senior military officers who are being appointed to head these state enterprises. And there are an increasing number of retired military officers running for public office. And this serves the individual political ambitions of those who run for office. It doesn't necessarily serve the military's interest as a whole. And I think we also need to look at how Prabowo himself, Prabowo being Jokowi's main rival that, as Nava told us, was brought in as part of this reconciliation mechanism to be Minister of Defense. And he has systematically tried to enhance his power base through being Minister of Defense. And he had a history of running counterinsurgency operations, but I don't think there's a necessary correlation between the two. I think the man is blindly ambitious for his own purposes rather than having that emerge from the role he played in Papua, especially, or as head of the special forces. What he has done in the last 2 years is to create a reservist force. Initially, it's 3,000 reservists that he's created. He hopes to turn it into a 25,000 man force by the 2024 elections. And people are concerned that he would use these for a get out the vote mechanism or anything else that would serve his purposes when he runs what will certainly be his last campaign for president. So going back to Sheila's thesis, I think it works for the Philippines, and Sheila's made a very compelling case, which she'll tell us about, that counterinsurgency and democracy are incompatible, and that counterinsurgency directly fuels the undermining of democracy. I think it also applies in Burma. I don't think it works as well as an explanatory factor in Thailand and Indonesia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sidney. Sheila.
So if you don't mind, I'll sit down because I don't do very well behind podiums. So thank you, Sidney, for that sweep of Southeast Asia. I'll talk mainly about the Philippines. You know, and I talk mainly about the communist insurgency because if I include the Muslim insurgency, that's too complicated for 10 minutes. So last December, the Communist Party of the Philippines celebrated its 54th anniversary. It's the longest running Maoist insurgency in the world. The armed forces of the Philippines have been fighting a communist insurgency longer than that, since independence from American colonial rule in 1946. So they've been at it for 76, going on 77 years now. And this is a long time. We're a young country. Philippines as a nation was born only in 1946. So counterinsurgency precedes the birth of the nation. And the Philippine military and the Philippine police trace its origins actually to the American pacification campaign. That's what the Americans called it, but it was a war. It was a war that suppressed Philippine independence movement when the Americans, during the Spanish-American War, landed in the waters off Manila Bay and basically fomented basically started an occupation and a pacification and 50 years of colonial rule, and formed what would be the Philippine police and armed forces. So unlike other countries in Southeast Asia where the military was part of independence movements, the military in the Philippines was mainly a counterinsurgent force. It suppressed Philippine movement for independence, first against Spanish colonial rule and against, the remnants of those fighting against Spanish colonial rule, and then later American colonialism. So there's a different trajectory. They're not seen as nation builders as they are probably in Myanmar and Indonesia. They're certainly seen as, suppressors of the domestic population, or pacifiers, or domestication of local descent. So for the longest time, the United States funded and trained the Philippine police and military, especially during the Cold War. And as you know, the news of today is that the US is now going to build 9 bases in the Philippines after the bases were ousted in 1991. So there's been a 30-year lag during which US military was allowed to use the Philippines. There was a visiting forces agreement, but this time it's actual bases, meaning equipment and personnel are going to be stationed there. So Philippines and the United States are very much together in counterinsurgency. The Philippines was the proving ground for the counterinsurgency practices the US used. They say the Philippines was the first Vietnam because between 1898 and 1902, American soldiers basically used the tactics they used in the Indian Wars and transplanted and refined them in the Philippines. So those reconcentration camps, or what we call strategic hamlets, were started in the Philippines. The use of waterboarding as a torture method, again, innovated in the Philippines. The use of surveillance, record keeping. I mean, Alfred McCoy writes about this in Policing America's Empire, if you want to know that. But that, the US has always been a dominant force in determining not just counterinsurgency policy, but military and defense policy in the Philippines. So what is constant in the Philippines, regardless of regimes, whether it's a colonial regime or a post-colonial regime, a Cold War regime or not so Cold War regime, whether it's dictatorship or democracy, is really a counterinsurgency machinery that has been used against all forms of dissenters and mainly being used to defend the status quo in the Philippines, which is a status quo that, as I talked about earlier, a status quo that's dominated, first of all, in the beginning by a landed aristocracy, and later now more with new sources of wealth, basically still an oligarchy of wealth and power. So it's a defender not of democracy, and counterinsurgency is really not there to defend democracy. It's really there to defend that a very unequal status quo, whether it was in the 1940s and 50s against a peasant-led Hook rebellion, and then in the starting the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and up to the present, against, a communist-led rebellion, originally a combination of former peasant rebels together with students, but has become, especially during the Marcos era, a widespread movement. So after democracy, the counterinsurgent wars continued also with American support. When Aquino took over and said, I will unsheath the sword of war, she had the full support of the US defense establishment and also of the CIA. So the killings, these counterinsurgency campaigns continued uninterrupted, continued for the last 120 years. It's partly because the insurgents and the threats to the oligarchy to power have continued throughout that time. So what is the result? The result is a normalization. When I mean counterinsurgency, I don't just mean the military, but I mean a mindset that permeates government, that dissent is an existential threat, not necessarily to democracy, but to the existence of the state, and that it has to be crushed at whatever cost, through whatever means, whether legal or illegal. And that means not just through armed force, but also through a state propaganda machinery that basically says communists are threats to the well-being of society. So we call this now red tagging, but that's basically the othering of communists, or those accused to be communists because they happen to be critical of the government. And that the way to deal with dissent is not by bringing them to court or addressing social reforms, but through extrajudicial means, basically by killing, torturing, and imprisoning without charges because the Communist Party has been legalized. What this means is that political discourse in the Philippines has been constrained. If legitimate criticism is seen as subversive, then it's very difficult for people to operate out in the open. It also means the increased clout for the police and the military beyond the ability of other democratic institutions, whether it's the press, the courts, the political opposition, or Congress, to rein in military and police power. So this counterinsurgency machine is something inherited from colonialism, the Cold War, dictatorship, et cetera, and it was ready for deployment, has always been ready for deployment against crime and insurgency and political dissent. It's a repertoire of tactics, which I'll go into which later. So when President Duterte started a drug war when he was elected to office in 2016, basically he had a machinery already in place. All he had to do, it was plug and play, as they say. So the drug war carnage, around 6,000 according to the police, 30,000 according to human rights, was made possible because you already had a machinery for doing extrajudicial killings and a machinery of surveillance that had kept track of drug users, criminals, and other dissenters. So all you needed to do was what Duterte did, was to hype up the threat of drugs as a threat to society, and then press the button on that machine. And Duterte had practice in this because when he was mayor of Davao for more than 20 years, he had unleashed the Davao Death Squad. And Davao was the center of both insurgency and counterinsurgency. And from there, Duterte learned the tricks and even recruited the personnel to implement his drug war. So his police chief was that basically led the war on drugs in 2016, was a Davao police officer, was police chief of Davao. And so were all the other police chiefs. I have a list of these police officers in my chapter, but basically you see how what was effective in Davao, the tactics effective in Davao, is basically threats, propaganda, intimidation, public naming and shaming of criminals. They did that before with insurgents. It was then deployed nationally into what became the drug war. So the drug war was executed with such velocity. Most of the killings took place in the first year of Duterte's presidency. And they started even once Duterte was proclaimed president, and they were already there on his first day as president. It's because he inherited counterinsurgency and personnel from the anti-communist campaigns. So the manpower, as I said, the police officers who served both counterinsurgency and anti-crime campaigns in Davao, the techniques, extrajudicial killings, surveillance, sowing intrigue in local and dividing local communities, propaganda using social media, but also radio and TV, the othering of drug dealers, which is Duterte also used to other communists. He said famously, shabu, which is crystal meth, it's the primary form of drug addiction in the Philippines. He said, shabu fries the brains of users and people are no longer viable, and drug addicts are no longer viable as human beings if they use shabu. So that kind of rhetoric meant that created an atmosphere where it was justifiable, even even good to execute drug addicts. What this meant was communities were divided, neighbors were forced to tell each other, civilian informers were surveilled, community bonds were wrecked, and community trust was destroyed, which has long-term effects on community building and essentially for building democracy. The drug war and the counterinsurgency campaign also created opportunities for corruption for the military, for the police. And the military was not really that involved, but counterinsurgency also created opportunities for money making. There's a direct link between corruption and human rights. Counterinsurgency and anti-crime campaigns, I lump them together because it's the same people doing it and the same tactics that they use. They provided a cover for police corruption. Policing in the Philippines, and I don't say this lightly, I mean, I'm really serious, is a criminal enterprise. Policemen live off the proceeds of crime. If they don't run the criminal syndicates themselves, they benefit from protecting criminal syndicates. The drug war entrenched the system and provided fresh opportunities for the police to make money through extortion from potential victims, stealing the belongings of those already dead, and even getting cuts from funeral parlors for those they had killed. So it was like, I don't know, is that vertical integration or horizontal integration? So from killing to funeral, they made money every step of the way. They made money from killing. The police have always been involved in contract killings. You know, as a journalist in the Philippines, I was involved in helping investigate the killings of journalists. And in many of these cases, the perpetrators were policemen, former or retired policemen, and their contracts were like for 100,000 pesos. I mean, a friend of mine was killed in Cotabato by a policeman who was paid something like $2,000 for contract for the killing. The police provide protection for smuggling, for gambling, for small-scale mining, for nightclubs, for prostitution, and for drugs. There's also a system, I found this out when I was investigating the killing of this South Korean businessman in Pampanga. And by 3 police officers who kidnapped him, abducted him, and then asked ransom money from his widow, even though they had already killed him. And that police operation was off the books, but it was funded by a consortium of policemen. So what they do is, we're going to launch an anti-crime operation, but we don't have money for the police to do an anti-kidnapping or anti-crime operation. So police officers front up the money, and then whatever proceeds they get from kidnapping for ransom or from the sale of drugs that they seize, they would then divide. It was like a mini stock exchange where you invest in anti-crime operations. I've done a lot of reporting on the police, and I've also spoken to the police. So back in the day when there were attempts to reform the police, I was asked to give a talk to police officers at the Asian Institute of Management about corruption. And I talked about hueting, which is illegal gambling, and how the police were protecting illegal gambling. So the question I got from one of the police officers was, is it okay to use hueting or gambling money to fight insurgency? So this was the kind of moral dilemmas that the police faced. I usually can answer questions, but that one, really stumped. I did not expect. So, so policemen are, people have said the police are instruments of political bosses, of powerful people. That's true to a sense, but I always see them as like, from my conversations with them, but really as entrepreneurs, the very enterprising people. They will use every opportunity to make money while also advancing in their careers. So career advancement sometimes means you have to be not too obviously corrupt, or career advancement may mean following the boss, or career advancement may be supporting a local politician. But it is this very chaotic and very, decentralized forces of power, organized crime, politicians, rich businessmen. Police also provide security services for businessmen. One of the police officers I talked to also sold real estate because he made so many connections, real estate developers. He ended up selling it. So this is what I mean, but by police being entrepreneurship. But my point is that counterinsurgency and anti-crime operations create opportunities for all sorts of things, including corruption and entrepreneurial opportunities for the policemen. So at the end, what does this mean? You have somewhat chaotic, anarchic, and decentralized power, but in the end, it's a system that is remarkably resilient, where, dissent is crushed, but dissent is also allowed, where you can negotiate, where you can buy your way out, where corrupt policemen may be persuaded, if you're a dissident, for example, it has happened, to release you because, you can pay him money. So that resilience, it's not rule bound, but it's, I I don't know. I don't have the anthropological language to be able to explain it, but it's a system that lasts because there are ways out of that system. And it's a system because it's not rule bound. It also damages rule of law and democracy in the long run, because it becomes a matter of not institutional rule of law, but kind of negotiable rule of law from where everybody benefits and everybody somehow, even if they're effed up by the system, somehow benefit or able to work the system as well. I don't know if that makes sense. That's a journalist talking from years of dealing with all sorts of people, but that's the way I see it. Yeah.
Can I just have one comment? Because it seems to me that what you're describing
Yeah.
of this system that's been in place for so long suggests that it's wrong to say that the Philippines is in democratic decline because it never had a functioning democracy in the first place.
Democracy is an up and down thing. It's not, there were moments, I would say, in the 1990s when there were opportunities for real reform because the post-Marcos system hadn't yet settled in, and the military was divided and factionalized. So yeah, there are, my NGO friends would call it conjunctural moments where reform is possible. But that the system is, as I said, from birth, it's been, it was damaged at birth. So I say it has, what do you call it when somebody, the DNA, there's something wrong with the chromosomes of this democratic baby. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sheila. Awesome. And now we'll move to questions.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so once again, I'm really intrigued by this, like thinking carefully about counterinsurgency tactics. What I'm trying to ask is for you to help me be more discerning, because what I'm sort of situations that are matters of militaries, broadly speaking, in the way militaries in very many places, not just in South Asia, but all over Europe and arguably occasions in North America, right, have subversive institutions when it comes to the sustainability of what we recognize as democratic. So how do we tie the somewhat authoritarian tendencies of using counterinsurgency tactics?
I think that at one level, you have to look at the ways the militaries developed in the first place. So did they have a major role in an independence war that gave them some credibility in the population at large as this builder of the nation kind of phenomenon? I think you also have to look at the size of the insurgencies where you could conceivably argue that there was a legitimate security threat to the nation that only the military, as the wielder of force, could respond to. So I don't think, for example, that the Deep South insurgency in Thailand ever really threatened the nation in the same way that the NPA maybe did in the Philippines. and that therefore there isn't the same rationale for the political role that the Thai military has played over time as there is where you actually somehow have to deal with a genuine security threat. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the problem with the Philippines, it's that the Philippine military is not an autonomous institution. For a long time, it was tied to the apron strings of the United States, and that still is, yeah. And so it's very difficult to delineate what are, domestic versus, yeah. So that's the other complication for the Philippines, apart from the history of the military not being a suppressor of independence rather than part of the independence struggle.
But I think this whole search for funds is also a big issue, because if you look at the way that military operations against putative insurgencies in Indonesia, in Myanmar, or in the Philippines become a real cash cow for the military, it gives it a new rationale that goes way beyond any kind of security imperative.
Hi, I have actually for all that really. In the U.S., we make a real distinction, fairly wrongly, legal and otherwise between police and military. But it seems like there's a range across the country where you're talking about whether there's a distinction. I also wanted to just insert a question that's related, which is around the difference in your mind, distinction in your mind between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, how that's understood. Of course, that is only an American sport. That's a huge piece of what the U.S. has been pushing out into the world since 9/11, is counterterrorism tactics, maybe even more than pointing specifically as a set of strategies, tactics, and psychology of policing. So I would love to hear you.
Take the first question. In the Philippines, the police during the Marcos era, were part of the Philippine military. And then after Marcos fell, they become the Philippine National Police. They were the Philippine Constabulary before attached to the Armed Forces of the Philippines. But then in 1990, I believe, there was a new law that separated them from the armed forces. But for a long time, including the current police officers, they were schooled in the Philippine Military Academy. And only after 1990 was there a police academy. So they were together until recently. And for counterinsurgency, both the police and the military are deployed. Yeah.
That the difference between the police and the military has come down to a notion that the police should deal with law and order issues and internal security, whereas the military should deal with external threats. In the Philippines, it never got straightened out. In Indonesia, the police were also part of the military, but were separated in 1998 as part of the reform movement. And the reaction of the military was to go along with that, which was critically important to the survival of democracy, but then to decide that, oh, it's these junior partners of ours, the police, who are completely incompetent and incapable. We need to get that role back. And that's one of the reasons that they have tried to claw their way back through a variety of tactics to take on a greater internal security role now. Terrorism and counterterrorism has been one of the great battlefields between the military and the police in Indonesia. And so far, the military has not won. They've been denied a role in terrorism, in counterterrorism, and the police have gotten not only credibility from their role as the lead agency, but also a huge amount of money. And it's the money that the military wants as much as it is the actual recognition that they have the operational capacity to get involved in this. But one interesting consequence is that because the military in the Philippines is the lead counterterrorism agency, and it's the police in the most of the rest of Southeast Asia, it means that cross-country cooperation is automatically made more difficult because police can only talk to police and military can only talk to military.
Well, the other complication is that there's often competition between the police and the military, especially in large counterterrorism operations, including about who gets the reward money that the US is giving for.
The Philippines has these bounty.
Yes,
this
it's the bounty
program.
system for terrorists. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very important for the police to be in charge as a civilian agency in charge of internal security rather than the military. Why? Because by definition, the military fights what it sees as enemies, not as upright citizens who may have gone astray and could be rehabilitated.
Well, the problem there is that in the Philippines, there was no external threat, and we had to rely on the US because of the Mutual Defense Treaty to take care of external threats. So the military has always been just focused on internal threats, and therefore this enemy, looking at communists or its own citizens as the enemy was deeply ingrained in their psyche.
Pick up the earlier point, very similar in many Latin American countries, right? Central America, also long tradition of there are effectively no external threats of any sort, and it's mostly about internal security. Yeah, now. Okay, one second.
Thanks. Could you both comment on, you've talked about the political role of the military or what they're trying to do. What about the police? Are you seeing increasing politicization of the police or attempts for police to have more role in politics?
We're certainly seeing that in Indonesia, and it began with Jokowi again. And it began when Tito became head of the police force. And for the first time, the police saw the rival candidate, that is Prabowo, as a serious institutional threat, because they believed that if Prabowo were to be elected, that would mean that he, being the head of the police as representing the military, would place the police under the Ministry of Home Affairs rather than being directly under the president as they are now. And to avoid that, the police were used by the Jokowi campaign to actually get out the vote and to contribute to the disinformation campaign.
Well, the police in the Philippines have always been politicized, especially more so during the Duterte era. They were politicized with the devolution of powers. Police power was devolved to local officials, but what Duterte attempted to do was to centralize it again, and mainly use the drug war to centralize police powers in the office of the president.
Wondering if I could, moderator's prerogative, and say, so we might say that you painted a perhaps dark picture. And so wondering then in that particular context, so what is, and again, this is a challenge that's facing, other countries, other middle income countries like the Philippines, Latin America, South Africa, elsewhere. Like, so what
I
is,
think there's a policing problem here too.
and totally, the US, absolutely. So what is the pathway for reform?
In a way, the pathway to reform is through getting a healthy political opposition, Because right now you are systematically removing some of the checks over executive authority. And if you put them back by having a good opposition that provided some oversight, you might be able to enact some kinds of check on police corruption, on military creeping involvement in internal security and so on. There actually is a law in Indonesia called the Armed Forces Law, which says that all military operations must have the approval of the House of Representatives. It has never once been enforced. And all of the military activity in Papua, for example, is not officially counterinsurgency, it's territorial guidance.
I think we have to reform the justice system. To me, it's the root of a lot of the problems because the police are never held to account, or the military, or anyone, everyone. That over, yes. So if you had a functioning court system, the excesses of the police, which people excuse because the courts don't work, so you kill a criminal because if you bring him to court, nothing ever is going to happen. So if you had a judiciary that's able to mete out justice, then the police loses its legitimacy, and the police uses, the public. Basically, there's strong support for extrajudicial killings in the Philippines because they see that the justice system is so broken and that you need to take shortcuts. And among police officers, that's also deeply ingrained that we guard the safety of the people. We are the only reason we are not into the abyss of anarchy. They actually, policemen, no matter how corrupt they are, see themselves as defenders of citizens. And that's because the justice system is so broken. So I really think the fundamental reform is reforming the justice system.
I think certainly working on accountability is critical, but I think you have to go through several steps before you get to the accountability reform.
I was under the potentially quite erroneous impression that at least some significant proportion of the violence we've seen, including against journalists and others in the Philippines, has also been fairly privatized armies and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering where they fit into this, if these are actually ex-police or tied to the police or military. But also then, I was prompted to think this by this idea of enforcing the political opposition, for instance. But in as much as political power and dynastic power in particular may have come to be seen as linked with a military power, very Weberian, control of the means of coercion, how to do that without resulting in some sort of spiraling violence or militarization, or what the longer term effects of all this have been from this congenitally defective democracy has been on the nature of contestation, the nature of activism and so forth. How is it that there has been a largely peaceful activist tradition, for instance, not entirely, but largely, even though so much of what it's up against is a coercive response, and whether that's diminished over years, and if that also has to do then with privatization, not just amongst political dynasties, but also privatized violence within, other circles. Sorry, it's a very convoluted question.
Well, on the question of privatized violence, that is so true because it's always been the case that the policemen were used to guard plantations, for example, or landowners, and were hired. Even when they were in their uniforms, they were basically the hired goons or guns of landlords and politicians. So that distinction between what is public and private has never been clear, not even to the police officers themselves. They've always seen themselves as operating in this gray zone, both private and state and public, both legal and extra legal. And so that's part of the congenital deformity of Philippine democracy. And it's precisely because of that you have dissent, because this system is certainly not fair. It's skewed against ordinary people. And dissenters have been both armed and unarmed. The Philippines has a tradition both of armed insurgency and nonviolent dissent. And so it's a self-perpetuating cycle that somehow, as I said, is resilient.
I think the other interesting thing is that I've been involved in these series of efforts to try and get more cooperation among police forces of the region on transnational issues, particularly on counterterrorism. And the Indonesians don't want to share anything with the Philippines because they are afraid that the police they share it will be related to the Abu Sayyaf or one of the other organizations.
They're probably right.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can follow up again. So on this question, on the one hand, the NPA's insurgency is not nearly at the scale that it was, right? It's declined. Is the only thing worse for the Philippine military than actually totally defeating the NPA? I mean, is that actually the worst case scenario for the Philippine military, is totally defeating the NPA? It always needs to have it
No,
there as a justification.
I believe the military is divided about this. I think the military would like to be focused on fighting China and incursions in the south.
Or at least a wing of it.
A wing of it, the professional wing of it, because they see that, as the proper role of the military, but also as a way in which they can get more boats, more planes, more largesse, more military aid from the US. And so we should be watching this move of Marcos to allow the US back into the Philippines, because does that mean that the military too will be more focused on external threats rather than internal threats? I also think that there's a faction of the military that really hates the communists and wants to eviscerate them. And that's being done now with such ferocity, and it's so open now. Suspected cadres are being killed right in their homes in the city, no longer in the countryside. And what I've heard is that they've been using drones as well, US-made drones, to hone in on the leadership. So they're decapitating. I think what they want is to decapitate the leadership and then be able to, this is what some defense officers are saying, we will negotiate with them at the local level, but not at the national level.
But what's interesting is they also believe they've liquidated the Abu Sayyaf, and all of these intensive military operations have also been done by the army, not the police, have been aimed at decapitating the Abu Sayyaf, and it has never worked. And what it does is create a new motive of revenge, a new generation of people who are determined to basically regrow the organization that their fathers and grandfathers were in.
Titus.
Itself is very complicated, but just touch on what are the basic things are missing that causes the judicial system to not function. For example, like, because we don't have judges, they don't appoint the judges, the budgetary allocation is terrible, so you can't create the positions and people who are the infrastructure. The police do a terrible job of investigation. There's no evidence.
All of the above.
All of those, including the fact that it takes 10 to 15 years to adjudicate a court case. So there's no incentive. It's very expensive. Prosecutors can be bought. The police can be bought. The usual dysfunctions. Yeah.
I remember going to a court in the Philippines, and the stacks of case material was just piled up in the hallways. There was no system for filing. People lose documents all the time.
Yeah.
They had this huge massacre, the Ampatuans
yeah.
in, when was it?
2006, I think.
Yeah. And so 57 journalists mostly were killed by one of these private armed groups. And it took so long for the case to come to trial that most of the key witnesses had been shot and killed by the family.
Yeah.
Before it was tried.
Yeah. And also a lack of resources. I remember when I was working in journalist killings, I would call the police and say, You know, there's this policeman, he was accused of killing this journalist. He's walking around in that city. This was in Mindanao. Why don't you arrest him? And this police officer said, well, you know, the policeman there will not arrest him because he's one of them. And I said, why don't you send somebody to go there? He said, okay, if you give us the money for plane fare, we're going to send a team of policemen over. Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Like I'm thinking about the LAPD gangs, for example, or like kind of, I don't know where Rikers Island is in my mind, like so largely right now, but this idea that like police can just they can throw them kind of, you know, without a trial into jail, basically, because, you know, the term means of coercion I appreciate, because they have force. They are supposed to be the wing of democracy that is supposed to enforce it, you know, by force if necessary. And so I guess like the idea where it's like, well, if we had an opposition party, I know that US and Philippines are so different, but the US has one. In fact, we went from the Republicans to Democrats just now, and police brutality has worsened. Like, we literally gets worse by the month. And then the idea that, so it's like, okay, judicial system. My question is kind of like, is there actually a legitimate way forward to reform the judicial system in a meaningful sense? Because it seems like, since police are the ones who have the guns, you know, they're not going to prosecute themselves, and especially not when it's so profitable, which is the other thing kind of in my head. It seems like they're just acting like anyone else in a capitalist society where it's profitable. So they're going to take the actions that profit, and they have the guns to do it. So they're going to continue to do it. So in that sense, is any reform that can actually fix that, when at the end of the day, if they're going to take profitable action and they're going to. Like, I guess like, I kind of have trouble imagining any actual path forward within the system as it is. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
You know, back in, I think it was in 2006, the Commission on Human Rights investigated Davao City, where there were a lot of extrajudicial killings. This was during the mayoralty of Rodrigo Duterte, who was mayor of Davao at that time. And there have been a large number of extrajudicial killings. They investigated and they got witnesses to write affidavits. It was a very good case. And they actually recommended that all the police officers in Davao City be taken out of there, and that the government, the national police, take over the Davao police and clean it up. That was never done, obviously. One, because they were afraid that these policemen would fight back. Second, the politicians didn't want to upset Duterte because Davao was one of the largest voting populations in the whole of Mindanao. So political and other considerations and then the drug war happened 10 years later. So yeah, it is, I think we should have tamped this at the beginning. We had that opportunity and we didn't. But having said that, I mean, look at in a way, what happened to the Ampatuan family. They were brought to court. They're now in jail, the ones who perpetrated this massacre. But there's so many of them that some of them are now back in public office. So it's a combination of political, police, the system, the fear, the intimidation, but also the patronage. So yeah, it's difficult.
But I think what we've seen in a number of countries is that you have periodically really good people rise to senior positions in the police or in the military, but it's so personalized that the reforms last only as long as that individual is in power. And once they are transferred or retire or whatever, everything goes back to square one. And it's the lack of institutionalization, which I think only comes again back to long-term political reform, which is not going to happen anytime soon.
Yes. Sadly, we're undoing the first panel here, all the optimism in the first panel.
Oh, Emery.
This is kind of a segue to the last panel on the role of external factors, as you may guess. But, you know, just to your point, Sheila, that, you know, now the Philippines is looking to an external threat is looking to China. Obviously, we've seen the same thing in Indonesia, right? You've got the two largest archipelagic states in the world with these huge militaries, traditionally have not had an external threat. And so they had an internal security force, right? That for all of these reasons of insurgencies that you've discussed, but that's changing now, right? And so if the real threat is maritime, is defensive islands, for which you need boats and planes, et cetera, not men in uniforms with guns against their own population. Is there any hope that that could change any of these dynamics? I'm pessimistic, but I have the opportunity to ask you folks, so I figured I would. Thank you.
A strong military that has a tradition of suppressing its own people.
The problem is
Yes.
they're investing in China for their own personal interests. Yeah. But,
Yeah,
okay.
I think there could be a core of professional officers who might be willing to look at the institutional interests of the military rather than their own personal interests. And that's quite possible. Maybe there's a core of younger officers who saying, we've been fighting this insurgency since the founding of the army. Maybe it's time now to be a modern, have self-respect in the international community. Maybe it's a question of personalities and whether that's going to happen.
I think it's also the question of the navies in these countries always being the kind of ugly stepsister and not the not the army with all of the prestige and power. I think as well, if you look at attitudes toward China within the Indonesian bureaucracy, it's the foreign ministry that's most alarmed by Chinese aggression as they see it, not the military. And I think it's partly because there are a lot of deep personal interests in resources in China, and Luhut Panjaitan is one of the main ones.
So the maritime militias, fishing mafias, and all that.
Sirikan from Thailand. Not really a question, but Thailand is also part of the case being discussed. So I think the Thai military is actually looking back toward the history and what Sidney said, looking back how it shaped the Thai military. We really can't leave out the factor that actually is really focused and centered around the Thai monarchy. Right, so we don't have the external threats. The insurgency in the Deep South actually was crafted on the discourses that would be the separatists and that would actually separate the kingdom. So that would actually be the threat to the monarchy itself. And of course, we agree that there's a lot of intervention into the civilian-led politics in Thailand, but more and more nowadays, I think the resistance and the pro-democracy movement in the youth and the general public in Thailand sees that it is a unified form of the monarchy and the military. So it's like monarchy military nexus that are really, functions in Thailand. So it's really intense at the moment that with the new king and all the royal realm and everything that consolidate, for example, having the king has transferred, at least 2 military units from the civilian ministry, and now he has his own army. So whatever is going to happen in the future, let's say another coup d'etat will be staged. Not wood, but who knows, right? I think the role of military, at least in Thailand, it's quite clear that there's no distinction between the monarchy and the military interference in politics.
There are new divisions being created by the unpopularity of the new king?
There is, but I still doubt that if we really hope for military, like the division and faction in military itself, because that was one of the first things that the new monarch did was to consolidated and unified all of the different army forces and the units. Before that, there was a King Guards, Queen's Guard, elsewhere. But right now, there's no unit like that. So I think more the division and the faction is more now toward the individuals inside of those systems. So I really agree about all the whole holistic institutional reforms, but Thailand has really have to push toward the monarchy reform as well. Thank you.
Question or just scratching your head? Behind you. In the blue. Were you just scratching your head or you had it right? Just scratching.
I'm Nicholas Becklin I'm a visiting fellow at Yale. Well, when I was in Thailand for Amnesty, I got the regular visits of the special branch, which was the police, and then the military intelligence, which was the military. And they had many questions, obviously, about Amnesty's activities, but one of the questions was, what did the other guys ask you? So I think the competition is there.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one. All right, well, please join me in thanking Sheila and Sidney.